Tonight at AWM, we are honored to host this conversation between one of our most distinguished literary artists and one of literature's young rising stars. It would be easier to list the awards Sandra Cisneros hasn't won to the ones she has. Her honors include NEA fellowships in both poetry and fiction, a MacArthur Fellowship, several honorary doctorates, and national and international book awards, including the National Medal of the Arts, awarded to her by President Obama in 2016. Her book, The House on Mango Street, has sold over 6 million copies, has been translated into over 20 languages, and is required reading in schools across the country and around the world. In 2000, she created the Alfredo Cisneros de Moral Foundation to honor the memory of her father and recognize Texas writers who exhibit exceptional talent and a profound commitment to their chosen form of expression. In 2014, the recipient of this foundation award was Fernando Flores, whose new book, The Tears of the Truffle Pig, is one of LitHub's and the millions most anticipated books of 2019. One of BuzzFeed and Tor.com's books to read this spring, and one of the Chicago Review of Books' new best books of May. His fiction and poetry have appeared in various publications since 2006. And he was featured as one of the 10 writers to watch in 2015 issue of Texas Monthly. He lives in Austin, Texas. Bienvenido al American Writers Museum. Mi nombre es Cristina Carrera y estoy aquí esta noche para presentar el programa. Antes de comenzar, un par de notas. Si aún no ha comprado libros, consulte a nuestro socio, Seminary Co-op 57th Street Books, en la parte posterior de la sala. Ambos autores firmaron libros cerca del mostrador y bienvenida del museo, al final del programa. Les solicitamos que se alineen en la parte de atrás para firmar los libros y nuestro personal estará disponible para ayudarlo. Esta noche en AWM nos sentimos honrados en ser los anfitriones de esta conversación entre uno de nuestros artistas literarios más distinguidos y una de las jóvenes estrellas emergentes de literatura. Sería más fácil enumerar los premios que Sandra Cisneros no tiene que los que ella tiene. Sus honores incluyen becas NEA, tanto en poesía como en ficción, una beca MacArthur, varios doctorados honorarios y premios nacionales e internacionales de libros, incluida la Medalla Nacional de las Artes que le otorgó el presidente Obama en el 2016. Su libro, La Casa en Mango Street, ha vendido más de 6 millones de copias. Se ha traducido a más de 20 idiomas y se requiere lectura en escuelas de todo el país y del mundo. En el 2000 creó la Fundación Alfredo Cisneros de Moral para honrar la memoria de su padre y reconocer a los escritores de Texas, que exhiben talento excepcional y un profundo compromiso de la forma de expresión elegida. En el 2014, Fernando Flores recibió el premio de esta fundación. Su nuevo libro, Tears of the Truffle Pig, es un de LitHub y The Millions, libros más anticipados de 2019. Uno de BuzzFeed y Tor.com, libros de leer, y uno de Chicago Review of Books, mejores libros de mayo. Su ficción y poesía han aparecido en varias publicaciones desde 2006 y fue presentado como una de las 10 escritores para observar en la edición de octubre en el 2015 de Texas Monthly. Vive en Austin, Texas. Bienvenido a ambos y gracias por estar aquí. Welcome to you both and thank you for being here.
Bienvenidos. I'm so happy to be back in my hometown. And something extraordinary is happening to me tonight, and that is I have friends from San Miguel. My friend Lucina Kapman, a member of Penn San Miguel, former president, Penn San Miguel here. I have my nephew, the musician Javier Cisneros, right here. Award-winning trombone, right? Award-winning jazz trombonist. And I have my brother, the geologist, Arturo Cisneros, way in the back. Arturo, stand up so people know who you are. And he has to sit in the back because he has a train to catch in an hour. So, you know. Arturo, did you get your signed book? Okay, good. Okay, great. All right. It's always difficult for me to come to Chicago because I have more people I know and family to visit with, and it's rare that I have an opportunity to come to a museum. So this is a special gift for us to be here together, and the 2-year birthday, and to introduce a young writer that we introduced in 5 years ago. Was that when you got your 5 years ago? The Fernando Cisneros Foundation Award, which, by the way, I think you were the last year that we gave grants.
Definitely, yeah.
Right?
I think
it was the
very last year.
And I have to tell you, Fernando, I feel like a grandma today in a
thank
wonderful
you.
way, because you're like my child, and
I'm honored.
you know, and then this is your baby, so I'm the grandma of this book.
Yeah,
you know?
you totally are. Yeah.
And you know, I have to tell you, when I have to tell you the history of the Alfredo Cisneros del Moral Foundation. My father was an upholsterer. He was an immigrant who came to this country by buying the birth certificate of a nefarious San Antonio character who will remain nameless, but you can watch it on Finding Our Roots if you like. And my father bought this birth certificate from this nefarious character in 1942, the year when there were the most deaths in World War II. So my father crossed over. He was running away from home. My grandfather was a military man, and my father always knew he would have had a better life if he had stayed in Mexico. So he wasn't an economic refugee. He was a refugee from his father, running in exile from a military father. And he crossed over in Laredo, bought false papers from someone from San Antonio, and had the ill luck of being drafted under the false identity. And for some reason, which I don't know why, he served. And that's how he became a U.S. citizen. Eventually, halfway through his period of service, he identified himself as the real Alfredo Cisneros. But he regretted that he left behind the opportunity to study at the UNAM and have a middle-class life. He worked very hard, raised 7 children working with his hands, and always pushed us to go to school so we would use this and not this. I created the Alfredo Cisneros Foundation grant because I received so much help when I was a young writer from my father, my mother, and from the Chicago Arts Council, Illinois Arts Council, National Endowment for the Arts. All these grants helped me one after the other to get to my next stage in my life. And my father used to say, Sandra, cuide tu dinero, you know, save your money. And, but yet he was always an example of generosity, of giving money away, of supporting us and taking care of us, being there for us all the time. And so it gave me a lot of pleasure once he was gone to sign checks that said Alfredo Cisneros del Moral Foundation to help writers like you. And I know that he's here tonight in the spirit world. He's so proud of both of us tonight, and I'm happy that you're here with the last recipient of that award.
Oh, thank you, Sandra. I'm honored. I was honored to receive it, really.
Yeah. I think it's the only American award named after an upholsterer, as far as I know. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that award and what it did to your life?
Definitely. You know, when that book, around April, like 5 years ago, this guy running a literary Ponzi scheme out of his apartment here in Chicago actually put out the first volume of Death to the Bullshit Artists of South Texas, Volume 1. He put out 200 little hardback copies of the first 7 stories here. And I was lucky enough, even though only 200 were made, they were very well circulated. And a couple of people who came across it, Ben Olguin, who was a professor at in UTSA, I believe, and
University
Greg
of Texas,
Barrios.
San Antonio. People
in
here
San
in
Antonio.
Illinois don't
In San
know
Antonio,
what
yeah, in
UTSA
San Antonio,
is.
Texas. Yeah.
Okay.
And the great Greg Barrios They both.
Critic, Chicano,
Great
actually arts
Chicano-
critic at large.
Yeah, definitely. They both nominated me for the Alfredo Cisneros de Moral prize, and I was lucky enough to win the award. And at the
How
time,
much money did we give you?
I'm sorry,
How much money did you win?
I got $10,000. Yeah, which is incredible. And this is the incredible part, that within 10 days, all these crazy things happened. I won the Cisneros del Moral Award. I was laid off from my job. I was a barista for 9 years in Austin. I was evicted. And I got a job working at a bookstore only 2 days a week.
Oh,
So at this time, I gotten the money. All these crazy things happened, and at that time, I was in the crossroads, and I thought to myself, am I gonna revise all these old manuscripts that I had, or am I gonna try to do something new? And I was just so afraid that I decided, well, I'm gonna try something new, because I don't know if I'm ever gonna get this opportunity again. So for the next 3 months, I proceeded to, on my typewriter, try to write a novel. And I succeeded, and it ended up being the first draft, The Tears of the Truffle Pig. Here.
yeah. Did you read from that manuscript when I heard you when you won the award, or were you reading from
I
this
want,
one?
yeah, I read
You
the
read from
last
this
shorts.
one?
Yeah, totally.
See, the blurb on this book is actually about this book. So now when people read, when I see this, I said it's funny, futuristic, phenomenal. This is not funny. It's futuristic and phenomenal, but this is the funny one.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So then I thought, they put that blurb on this book.
Oh,
People are
okay.
going to think
I
I'm
didn't know that. I
Yeah.
didn't know that. How interesting. How do we fix that?
So, people are going to think I didn't read the book, but, I wrote the blurb on this
Oh, that's
one.
interesting. I had no idea. I wonder how that happened.
Yeah, then when I'm reading it, it's so, well, we'll talk about this book. But one of the things is you're on a book tour now, which I have to tell you, back in the old days, book tours were very common. You would get big bouquets of flowers, nice hotels, nice meals, and you would get a tour. But not anymore. Now, the industry doesn't have that kind of money, so if they invest it all in you, it's pretty amazing. That means they believe in you. But there's very few writers that go on tours. Like back in the old days, especially when I was a small press writer, they would send you like to the Houston Mall, and you would perform after the mariachis. Which I have to tell you, it's very hard to follow mariachis. Yeah. But I don't. There's low points that people have on book tours. You haven't been on a book tour long enough to know.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I want to give you some advice.
Please, yes. I live for listening to this.
And this is for you, how many people are writers out there? Can I have a show of hands? Wow. Okay, great. So when you publish, one of the things that's very important, they take your photograph, hold your book up next to your head. This way, they have to show the book when they show the photo. Okay? Do this. Or go. Or. As many different ways as you can do it. Okay?
Totally.
And then say, I gotta go. And they have to use that photo.
Yeah, totally.
The other thing, when you have someone that says, so what's your book about? Obviously, they haven't read your book.
Yeah.
And that's you can use to your advantage. So instead of taking their questions, you create the topics, and you have sound bites all prepared ahead of time. Well, this is a futuristic book, and it's pretty phenomenal because I wrote it 5 years ago, but actually what I wrote about is happening now. You see, you take the sound bites, you grab it, and you run with it, because otherwise they'll want to talk about so Fernando, is it true you're from South Texas? Just silly stuff, which we can't afford to talk about nonsense, because we're living in a time of crisis for people who are named Cisneros and Flores and who live on the border or who look like us.
Definitely.
It's important that you take over the interview.
Yeah.
Especially, you say, I only have 15 minutes, and talk about what you want in 15 minutes. Say, I gotta go.
Yeah, walking and talking.
Exactly. Another thing that I think is very important that I learned from my teachers here, Stud Sturkle and Gwendolyn Brooks, that you treat your audience when they come and get their book signed, they really want to talk to you. So you use that time as if they're the famous person and you are their fan.
Yes.
And Miss Brooks taught me that. She would be so wonderful and
Yeah.
how she treated every single person and looked them in the eye. And so then you learn to do a signature that isn't the one you put on the check, and you go, yeah, and are you a writer too? Yeah, okay, that's great. Who do you want this for? So you put your name first, and then you do theirs, and honor them. And those are my great teachers, Eduardo Galeano, Studs Terkel, and Gwendolyn Brooks. Yeah.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
incredible. Yeah.
I have some questions I want to ask you, but you can ask me one while I'm looking for the ones to
Yeah,
ask
I
you.
do have a question for you,
Yeah.
actually, Sandra. Like, I guess people always ask me, I haven't lived in South Texas in 15 years almost, and in a way, people still associate me as a South Texas writer. They ask me if I'm a South Texas writer. And I know you moved around a lot, and you've written a lot of your work in different cities. And I wonder if you associate any of your books like geographically, like, this is the book I wrote in Chicago, this is my San Antonio book, this is my...
Yeah. Well, House on Mongo Street never mentions in the entire book Chicago, except for one time when the girls are jumping rope and they're singing one of those girls' rhymes, jumping rhymes, engine number 9 running down Chicago line. That's the only time. I didn't mention any landmark places because I wanted everybody who read the book, whether they lived in the valley, in South Valley of Texas, or in Florida, or in Washington State, to feel like that was their address, that was their town. So, but it was written in Chicago. Some of it was written in Iowa City when I was a graduate student, and a lot of it was written in the old Bucktown neighborhood when I lived on Paulina, off of Armitage. And some of it is plucked from my students' lives in Pilsen, but it's my Chicago book.
Yeah.
And then I moved to San Antonio the year you were born.
Yeah.
It was the year House on Mongo Street was born.
1982.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So I moved, and the book came out at that time. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So A Woman Hauling Creek.
Yeah. Do you consider that your San Antonio book?
That's my Texas book.
Totally,
Yeah, it's my
totally,
San
yeah.
Antonio book. And Caramelo is Chicago, Texas, and Mexico.
Totally, yeah. That makes sense, yeah. Totally.
And Por Amor, my little story, it's my Mexico story.
That's definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I have some questions for you. One is, I lived in Sarajevo. I don't know if you know that, before the war, and I go back to former Yugoslavia in the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And you mentioned the cigarette, Herzegovina Flor, in the first page, and I thought, how the hell does he know this? Why that little detail in your book?
That's interesting. I read about Herzegovina Flor cigarettes. I think I like to put a lot of international things in all my stories. I have this theory about South Texas and the border. I think that the border is a very strange place. I think that all genres and the entire world somehow ends up at the border, So the idea of having my main character smoking these cigarettes that were these Russian cigarettes was an important detail for me. Sometimes when you're in South Texas and when you live in a place and you can't really escape, you find little ways to mentally leave, and that's one of those subtle ways. You smoke, foreign cigarettes, And also at the time, I read this article about Stalin's daughter and Stalin, and in the article it mentioned Stalin, how he liked to smoke these Herzegovina Flor cigarettes.
Yeah, but Herzegovina is in Bosnia, and it's Javanese tobacco.
Yeah.
So I wondered if it came from former Yugoslavia and went to Russia, or the other way around. I was just wondering.
That's interesting. Yeah. No. I guess that detail, the idea of somebody smoking a cigarette, and like you say, it comes from Java and all these things. I like how these things in life weave and end up in South Texas.
But don't you think that happens, especially, it could happen in Chicago if you grow up in a very poor neighborhood or someplace where you wish you could get out of, like I did, that the quickest airline ticket, the cheapest one, is a book.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah, definitely. So To me, yeah, and that was
Like
very
Emily
important.
Dickinson said, the greatest frigate is a book. You know,
Yeah.
that's the way you kind of, when you're going to get out of somewhere. We should explain to the audience what the Texas Valley is, where it is and what it is.
Definitely. I take it for granted that somehow I think that everybody knows the valley, but the valley is like the southernmost tip in Texas. The last battle of Civil War was fought in South Texas, in Brownsville, and not a lot of people know that. And it's a very strange place because it's almost like in the middle of the desert because it's right on the border. Mexico's on the other side, and San Antonio is 4 hours away. And between the South Texas and San Antonio is like nothing, just like a strange Texas desert, you know, mesquite, you know, just barren land everywhere. So living in South Texas, you're kind of like isolated. You have the border, you have Mexico over here, you have this long stretch of land before you reach the next big city, San Antonio. So you're kind of isolated. Not a lot of bands come through. You don't get a lot of culture in South Texas. You're very isolated. So growing up down there, you hold on to these little things, whether in culture and literature and art, and you just hold on to them for dear life. And you somehow, these things end up shaping you as you grow up down there in an isolated area.
It's a very economically depressed part of the world.
Yes, it is.
And, you know, I knew about it because I lived with a man from Raymondville, which is a little dusty town of
Definitely.
nothing. There's
Yeah,
nothing there,
nothing.
a little convenience store.
Yeah.
It looks like the last picture show, but it's like
Yeah.
the last picture show in the universe, you know?
Yeah,
It's like
definitely.
really nothing there. It's like the poorest part of Texas, isn't it?
Definitely.
So you're writing about, like in your first book, like punk bands.
Yeah, definitely. To me, it was really important. Like during writing both these books, I had to really ask myself, why am I writing a book? Why am I doing this? Why am I adding another book to the cultural canon or trying to add something to the conversation? So I had to really see and really try to view both American literature and Mexican American literature and see what wasn't represented that I could do something with. And to me, like I started, you know, I grew up in South Texas with a bunch of band influences, you know, underground bands that just, you know, sprout. They have a life of 2 years and then disappear. And there's this very rich culture of bands that form and just vanish in time. So to me, it was very important to try to capture some of this subculture that I felt was unrepresented in the cultural conversation and in literature, more importantly for me, because I felt it was really important to try and tell hold on to some of those stories and try to perpetuate them somehow.
Well, see, your writing's very Baroque, and I think that that's something that's distinctive for writers that are have a Latino or hyphenated identity, that we have to know all about English writers, and we have to know all about writers from the Americas, and we have to know all the writers that write in the peninsula of Spain. We have to, and then you and I have this affection for world literature,
Yes.
so we have to know everything.
Yeah.
And that shows in your writing. So can you share a little bit of your first book?
Definitely.
Like this title is so wonderful, Death to the Bullshit Artists of South Texas.
Yeah. And it's more of a facetious title. When I first started writing these stories, I wrote them on a typewriter. And every time I would finish a story, I would yell that out, Death to the Bullshit Artists of South Texas. Just a statement to myself, like I did it, you know? And after I wrote like 3 or 4 of them, to me, I realized that that's what it's got to be called. I have to call this story
And
this.
did all the first run of your 200, did they sell out?
So they sold out within like 8 months or something. And I told the publisher to not print any more. I was really satisfied with there being only 200
Did
of
you
them.
pay for the printing, or did the
No, he did it and everything. We kind of had a falling out. He ended up owing me money, and I figured out this was all a scam.
Well, see, this is what happens. People don't realize, like when you publish, especially small presses like that, sometimes they pay you. Like when House of Manga Street came out, they paid me like in copies and $500.
Yeah.
You
Wow.
know, that's when I was a small press writer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't get anything at all from this guy. So I had this.
No. I lie, Fernando. You got a good story.
Yeah, totally. The story is great, and I won the Cisneros and Moral Prize. So I was like, who cares? I'm glad that it happened the way it did.
My first book was a chapbook that Lorna D. Cervantes, the poet, and Gary Soto published. Gary put the money, and Lorna D. had Mango Press. And it was a little staple book called Bad Boys that published like 500 copies. They paid me in 100 copies, and I sold them for $1. And now they sell for over $1,000 on eBay.
Wow.
So like 2,000 now, Raul? Oh, Raul, I didn't see you. There's the writer Raul Nino and Molly, my friends right here in the front. I didn't even see you. Otherwise, I would have introduced you. 2,000? You're a librarian, so you know those things. Wow. Do you still have a copy? Oh, good for you. Hang on to it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so if those 200 copies are going to be collector's items.
Yeah.
That's why you should always support, like, when poets carrying around they carry a big bag and say, want to buy my book? Buy it.
Yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
well, read for us.
So,
a little excerpt.
So the way I approach these stories, they were very intuitive. Like, I really wanted each story to be different. And this particular story is called The Performances of Liliana Krause. And I wrote this story in around September of 2011. I wrote the introduction to this story, and it was before the artist Leonora Carrington, who lived in Mexico City, passed away. And I had a dream with Leonora Carrington. After not thinking about her for a long time, somehow I had this dream. I woke up and I was sweating, and I wrote this introduction. I didn't know what the story was going to be, but I knew that Leonora Carrington had something to do with it. So this is the beginning of the story, called The Performances of Liliana Krause. The story Liliana Krause pieced together and would come to believe regarding her birth in Mexico City was this. Leonora Carrington in Antwerp had a dream more like a beam of light cascading through her chakras, one she'd experienced only twice before, as a girl when she attended the Academy of Art and when she was in love in Paris during the Nazi occupation of France. The trance this beam of light suspended her in was actually an avalanche. It carried visions of liquid fire, of shifting, multicolored sands, and ribbons of flesh. She could see these ribbons like bloody, slippery cartilage along her body, like a liquid sensation making her shiver, and what she felt was her Holy Ghost. The Holy Ghost that was everybody making up the world, the people she knew and the ones she'd never see, in their suffering, elegance, grace, and throbbing murder. Those people and things existed in the world of the senses because they existed within herself. And jolted in that auburn of rays, like dry leaves falling around her body, building a mountain of sensations around her, she felt what she later referred to as her penultimate sensation, that liquid healing light which makes us gasp at the beauty right before the necessary rapture. She realized the light was a soul trying to punch through to make itself aware that the fleshy ribbons were actually a singular light manifesting into this world as a person. She thought, if light is necessary in birth, and if birth eventually brings us death, and if murder exists hand in hand with virtue, and if life is necessary, beginnings are necessary, then so must be endings. Therefore, a rapture must be necessary.
Okay, thank you. People assume because you won the Alfredo Cisneros del Moral Award that I know you, but you, until very recently, were calling me Senora Cisneros in my emails because you just didn't.
Totally.
I said, please don't call me that.
Yeah, totally.
But how did you become a writer coming from, there's one writer we all know from the Valley, Gloria Anzaldúa, and she had to run away because she was a lesbian writer in order to survive. That's a part of the world where gay and lesbian people get killed.
Totally.
So they have to go to the nearest big city, which is San Antonio, which is a gay mecca.
Yes.
But you're not a gay writer. Well, maybe you are. I don't know. I don't presume. But you're not. Why did you leave the Valley? How did you leave? How did you make your route to becoming a writer? Because I think we have to reinvent ourselves.
Totally.
We have to find a way. Like I didn't have any role models when I was a young writer. I met Gwendolyn Brooks when I was already, after I graduate school. But how do you know how to become a writer when you come from neighborhood where there's no bookstores except
Yeah.
Gigi's Exotic Books.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I grew up without a place. There was no bookstores growing up in South Texas ever. So how I would get books, to me when I was growing up, right up until when I was like 22, I think, literature to me was something of the past. To me, there were no writers like writing now, at the time. So I would go to the Mission Public Library, and they had a little tiny room, like a closet, where they sell books for $1 that were damaged or something. So that's how I came across a lot of books. That's how I
That
came
was your
across.
first purchase of a book at the dollar?
That was my first book purchase right
Can
there.
I tell you about my first purchase?
Yeah, that's
I didn't know that people. I thought books were so valuable that they were issued by the church and state, that you couldn't actually own one. Because I didn't know people owned books. I only saw them in Chicago Public Library. But I remember you'd go to the Sears, the big Sears on Holman. It was like for those of you who remember Sears, I'm giving away my age, there was the big mail order catalog establishment on Holman, and they would have like the rejects or the damaged products in the basement. And like other people would, on Friday night would go out to dinner, we would go to Sears. That was our big Friday night thing on payday. My mom would buy a box of popcorn and a little fistful of cashews, which she always hid in her underwear drawer, but we knew they were there, so we'd go in and steal some. And I was with my mother and father, and we would be digging in these bins in the bargain basement, damaged goods. And they would have these box sets of the classics. And there was one volume that was lost, and they were selling, and it was Alice in Wonderland. And it was 50 cents. It was red with a garish kind of popcorn oil yellow edging, pretending to be gold. And I begged if I could please have that book. It was 50 cents, and it was my first book that I bought, but not the first book, of course, I read. And I remember I loved it so much, but one day I was trying to open a bottle of perfume, and I tugged, and it spilled all over the pages of Alice in Wonderland, which made all the pages wavy, but it smelled nice.
It smelled pretty. That's great. That's a great story.
That's my story.
That's awesome. It's great how you in these moments where you're able to find like a pearl in these
Yes.
situations.
And when you don't have books in your house,
Yeah.
Even now when people ask me to sign the book and they crack it open, it's like, no, I just I feel like they cracked open my bones. They're so precious and wonderful. Do you feel like that?
Yeah, definitely, I do. Yeah, especially because they were so scarce growing up. And
So how do you make your way from the dollar box
Yeah.
at the Mission Library?
yeah, so my parents were from Mexico. Yeah, my dad was born in South Texas and my mother was born in Mexico. They were both dropped out of high school. Neither of them were really readers. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. My parents and my whole entire family did everything they could so that I would not be artistically inclined. So I never had really any kind of support network with my family or even with my friends, really. So to me, writing was always something that I did privately. And when I was about 22 years old, my car broke down. I lost my job in South Texas. I had nothing. And somebody gave me a typewriter. And I knew somebody who lived in Austin. And to me, I was like, I got to get out of South Texas. I called my friend up. And within 3 days, I moved with like $20 in my pocket to Austin, Texas with a bag of my clothes and the typewriter. And I got a job washing dishes. And this is summer of 2005. I got a job washing dishes, and that's what I would do. I'd wash dishes, and nobody would bother me. And I'd go home, and I'd read, and I'd write on the typewriter. And whenever they try to give me like a better position or raise, I'd say no. I like being here. Nobody bothers me. I can think about what I'm gonna work on when I go home.
But that's writing short stories. But writing a novel is something else.
It is.
It's like I used to say, those paintings and those statues you see in Mexico of the souls in purgatory? They're like this, with flames and chains. That's what writing a novel is like.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
And I would tell my other friends, rattle your chains so I know you're alive. Because, it's like a volunteering to go to jail. You know, well, I'll just go to jail for 10 years. See you later, you know. Then when you get out, it's like, oh my God, people are going to the movies, they're drinking wine. Oh, they are.
People have lives.
Yeah, and you know the real writers, especially in San Miguel, Lucina as well, you know, there's a lot of faux writers in San Miguel, you know. But the real writers, when you say like, hey, can we get together? Oh, I can't, I'm writing. But maybe next week after 8 o'clock. You know, those are the real writers.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So after that, you know, I just kept doing that for 10 years.
Those are short stories, but
That's 10 years.
the novel is a purgatory. It's a long commitment. This is a very different book, The Tears of the Truffle Pig.
Yeah.
Even though it says, you know, funny, I meant this one. How did you go from this to this?
You know, to be honest, I have no idea. I never, you know, I read somewhere that somebody called it a speculative fiction book, and it is.
It's futuristic.
It's
but
futuristic.
when I heard you, you know, back then, it would have been futuristic. But now, it's the reality of what's happening in the world now.
Yeah.
Can you give a little synopsis for our
Totally.
listeners?
Yeah, definitely. So, Tears of the Truffle Pig takes place like in an alternate South Texas with 2 border walls and a controversial 3rd border wall about to be erected. And it takes place in a time after its worldwide food shortage, kills off a lot of people, and inspires these scientists to create this thing called the filtering method, which is like out of troughs, they grow vegetables and fruit and at a rapid rate, and eventually that evolves into growing farm animals to be able to feed people. And around this time also, drugs have become legalized, so all the syndicates that had made their money off of drugs kind of hijacked this technology to bring back like extinct animals back to life. And even though the animals are only alive for a short amount of time, like 8 weeks, they'll get what is valuable out of them and try to sell them in the underground market, either to throw these exotic kind of crazy dinners where people pay a lot of money to eat these extinct animals prepared with top dollar chefs and stuff, or like to get their feathers and get anything valuable from them. And our main character is Esteban Bellacosa, whose brother is kidnapped by a headhunting syndicate. And the syndicates that really don't deal with this filtering technology, they kidnap people and they shrink their heads and they sell them to collectors. And the darker your skin is, the more indigenous you are, the more your head is worth. And they have a way of dyeing your skin if you're not. And so our main character is looking for his brother in this South Texas, and he kind of becomes manipulated by this investigative reporter who's writing an article about this underground dinners. Esteban Bellacosa becomes manipulated to go to attend one of these dinners, and from there, all these things happen to him.
Well, your writing is ultra baroque, and it's hard to read it quickly because, you know, even though I'm a speed reader, I had to go back and reread your book for tonight because I felt like every time I would come to a simile, your similes are so poetic and wonderful that I kept like stopping and saying, oh my God, does he write poetry? The cloudy sky grimaced like an old retiree counting change. MacArthur was foggy like it was inside of a glass bottle where somebody had discarded a cigarette. You know, things like that. And I would think, wow, that's good. Do you write poetry?
Yeah, for the longest time, when I first got a typewriter, I had an electric typewriter, and I figured out that they'd only write 15 pages, and before it ran out of ink cartridge. So I'd get so afraid to write fiction that I'd write poetry for a long time because the ink would last longer. So between 2005 and 2010, whenever I took breaks writing stories exclusively because of that, because I couldn't, the ink cartridges were kind of pricey at the time.
Well, that's funny because there's going to be a display of typewriters, I understand, very soon in the next room. And my typewriter, which I donated to the National Museum of Mexican Art, is going to be on loan here. But I only used it to write poetry.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
You
And
go
I knew
slower.
that. Yeah, you go slower. Yeah, totally.
So do you still write on typewriters?
I'm sorry?
Do you still use typewriters?
I only use typewriters to write my first drafts. Yeah.
Can we hear an excerpt from the new book?
Yes.
Because
totally.
I think your writing, is pretty futuristic, but unfortunately, you are telling many parts of this novel are happening now.
Yeah. Well, and that's just a coincidence or something. Maybe I don't know. Maybe this.
Maybe it's not a coincidence, because I think as writers we get into an intuitive state and
Yeah.
we become visionary without even realizing it.
Yeah. Definitely. That's how I think that if you leave yourself open, I think to possibilities, things appear in your writing that you have probably no control over that end up.
I would make up things, for example, in Caramelo, and later on I would find out it was true. And then the things that I thought were true, I made up.
That's interesting. You
Yeah.
know, it's interesting that you bring that up, Sandra, because I was wondering. I know you're a big Hans Christian Andersen fan.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and rereading. I remember you telling me recently something about Hans Christian Andersen that I didn't know, that he had problems with his teeth.
Yeah, he had bad
And
teeth.
rereading my Mango Street, there's this part that I think is the Edna's Ruthie section, and Ruthie has trouble with her teeth too. And I remembered Hans Christian Andersen, so I was wondering. I was like, I wonder if when Sandra wrote this, she knew this about Hans Christian Andersen, or you didn't.
No. The thing about Hans Christian Andersen, and people don't realize the things we're influenced by. Because there's Borges in your work, there's all kinds of punk music, there's Stalin cigarettes. It's international. You're so
Totally.
Baroque. But with me, the reason why I like Hans Christian Andersen is because he was working class. He was a working class Danish writer. Mother was an alcoholic washerwoman. Father was a cobbler who died, and he was a child. And his relatives would say, "Oh, he's so gifted. He's going to be great. He's going to be a poet." So they filled it in his head that he was greater than he really was. You know how mothers and grandmothers are. Well, they gave him a great sense of self-esteem, and he went off and made a writer for himself, but he had no education, and he was a total country bumpkin. And he eventually, through the kindness of strangers, got an education late in life, had to study with children because he was practically illiterate, became a playwright, and eventually, towards when he was older, wrote these little stories he called fairy tales that were not for children, they were for everyone. But what he did, and what he is extraordinary for, and what he gives me animo, encouragement for, is that he revolutionized Danish literature. Danish literature before Hans Christian Andersen was very lofty and written by the wealthy class. Mm-hmm. He brought in something of his grandmother, women's oral tales, what they call superstition, but were folk tales, and he brought in a kind of oral storyteller way that his people who were illiterate would tell stories, and they say, "Well, now we shall begin, and here the story goes. Giddy up!" Things like that you say orally enter into his writing.
Yeah.
So that was revolutionary.
Totally.
And we, as Chicano writers and as indigenous people who have our roots in the Americas before the world was round, we were here. Writing doesn't begin at 1490s. It begins with the great books of indigenous civilizations, many of which were burned, some of which survived, and our tales that are many survived by not being allowed to be burned because people speak them.
Yes.
Many of those tales. That is I think what makes our writing so distinctive, that it's so old, that it has a structure that's very different from European literature. But we've also inherited the English language. So we have our roots with the indigenous communities that have been here since before the world was round. We're inspired by by pre-conquest literature,
Yes,
as you are.
Definitely.
By Borges,
Yeah.
by Jean Rhys, by Marguerite Duras, by all of these writers from all around the world that influence us. That's why I'm always looking for writers in translation to spark a new, what can we do new with the English language? So show them what you can do.
Definitely, yeah. And to me, you're talking about like pre-conquest literature and aesthetics, and those were really important to me in writing this book. I was really interested in the stories that existed in Texas before written literature? You know, what kind of stories existed in this land? I asked myself, and the answer I always came to, like, the story, all these stories that existed in South Texas were fantastic stories, you know, with personifications of the elements, of the stars and everything. So to me, I was trying to access something like that, and also trying to say something about the world today, at least at the time. And this was before anybody could have predicted, you know, like the border wall going international and stuff like that, for some reason. But anyway, I'm going to read to you an excerpt from Tears of the Truffle Pig, and this is where our main character, Esteban Bellacosa, crosses into Mexico for the first time. Halfway over the Rio Grande, the fabric of the bridge changed. The Mexican half was built out of cobblestones and was slightly more vandalized. Bellacosa stopped at the bolted plaque commemorating the spot as the official divider of the two countries and looked through the 10-foot chain-link fence along the railing down at the river. He knew the Rio Grande naturally flowed eastward toward the Gulf, but Bellacosa swore it was running the opposite way. He watched as two children climbed the railing as high as his waist level to take a look. They were both pointing and smiling with the look of wonder Bellacosa hadn't seen in a child in so long that the sight nearly touched him, until he noticed the source of their amazement. It wasn't the water, but the two border walls, one built along the south side of the Rio Grande, the other along the north, and like two scheming sentinels, they escorted the river, their dying queen, as far as the eye could see into the horizon. The look of pleasure on the children's faces made his blood harden like lava in his veins. Suddenly, against the northern border wall, a few hundred yards away, a howling tall flame sprung to life. The children clapped. Bellacosa knew it was a controlled fire for the great cane, which threatened the structural integrity of the border walls, and he continued his walk.
Thank you. What does it mean to be an American writer? I saw that on the wall.
What does it mean to be an American writer?
I saw that here at the museum. What does it mean for you?
What does it mean to me? To me, it means to be aware of as many schools of literature as possible, and not just like writers from New York, or not just writers from Los Angeles. To me, and not just the canonical 20th century writers, the canonical 19th century writers, but also all these pockets of literature that existed throughout the 20th century and throughout now even, and to be aware of as many aesthetics as possible, and to ask myself how it relates to me and how it relates to the world around me, and try to be as open as possible to all these influences and to see what they do through me.
Do you have a responsibility? Do you feel like you have a responsibility? Because I know I feel like I have.
I'm sure, I bet.
I'm responsible to my mother and father's spirit, their memory, to honor them, to the community that we represent, to South Texas, to Chicago, to the working class, to women, to Mexicans, just the immigrants. It goes on and on and on. I don't know if you feel that kind of weight.
I do. The book, the book is dedicated. I dedicated the book for all that disappeared. At the time when I wrote this, there was a lot of tragedies going on that unfortunately we have forgotten now because of all the other tragedies that have come since then. And I was really, to me, it's impossible to be an artist from Texas and to not take into consideration the femicide that has happened in Ciudad Juarez for the last 20 years, or maybe even longer than that. And to me, I cannot ignore that in my work. My family, all my family lives along the border in Reynosa on the other side, and their everyday lives have been very much affected by everything going on in the border. That to me, it was very important to represent something that I could to my abilities to all these names and people who disappear and their stories disappeared. To me, I felt a huge responsibility to the disappeared stories of all these people and to try to access some of it through silence and through my work as well.
That's pretty heavy. That's beautiful. Thank you for. I'm glad I asked that question because
thank
that's
you,
really
Sandra.
beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
And I think that's what makes your writing so extraordinary, because you are aware of what's going on. Are you reading a lot of other writers? You look at the news. All this information sounds like fantasy, but all you have to do is just go online and read what's happening in Mexico. What news doesn't reach here?
Yes, definitely. And to me, and I can't ignore that. I can't ignore, especially in Austin, Texas, where I'm from, and in South Texas, I never met a lot of writers of my generation, and I asked myself why. Like a lot of fiction, I don't know a lot of fiction writers. I know a lot of poets, and so especially because of that, I felt a huge responsibility as to the kind of stories that I'm telling. Otherwise, why am I writing? Why, like you say, why be like that for 10 years?
Why close yourself in your house, your apartment for 10 years when you could go out and watch TV?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Why torment yourself, why to write a story,
Well, I want to thank you for picking up that mantle of representing all the people we love. I think one thing that my writing has taught me, and that's a life lesson, is that whatever we do with love on behalf of those we love, without a personal agenda, siempre sale bonito. It always turns out well. And I'm so honored to be associated with you, to be the grandmother of your book in any way.
The honor, I am honored,
I'm so
Sandra.
grateful. And this is the thing that happened when I left Chicago. I left because it was too difficult for me to live here and to live in the neighborhoods I could afford as a single woman, to live away from my father's roof, and to deal with the traffic and the despair I felt, the energy in Chicago. So I went and took a job where it was cheap, where I could live somewhere that was cheap, low overhead for 1 year. I'm gonna live in San Antonio, and it wound up to be 25. And, but then my roots dried up, and I tumbleweeded south to Mexico. And I said, I'm not coming back to Texas here. They treat me too badly. I'm not coming back. And now I go back like 4 times a year, and I'm seeing, my roots dried up because that was my destino. But I'm seeing the harvest of seeds I planted. So you make me very proud. I'm so honored to know you, Fernando.
Thank you,
Really.
Sandra. Thank you. I feel very grateful and privileged that your influence in my life goes way beyond your body of work,
Well,
which is so important.
There's so many good writers coming up now, from especially in California, Arizona, South Texas, West Texas. Cristina Granados writes fiction, and if you want to meet them, I invite you to apply or to come and donate a seminar to my workshop, Macondo, which I'm no longer running, but I guest teach there.
Definitely,
So,
I would love
any
to.
writers out there who want to apply, it's not a Latino exclusive organization. We work with writers who are activists, writers who believe in serving the underserved.
Definitely.
Okay?
Thank you so
now it's time
much,
for
Sandra.
questions, I think,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to ask people to please applaud. Thank you. If you want to raise a hand, I'll try and come by with a microphone, but I'm going to steal the first question if that's okay.
Sure.
And this was actually sent to me from someone who wanted me to ask. So as people who were raised in bilingual households, how do you think that affects your writing?
Oh, I love this question. Well, the multilingual speaker has multiple ways of seeing the world. And I feel as if, I love when I know a word exists in one culture and it doesn't exist in another, because
Yes.
it means that that culture recognizes this reality and the other does not. Like the word macho, because the Mexicans understand that that exists, That's a problem, it exists. Whereas in the United States, it's like, where? They had to borrow it. They had to borrow it from the Spanish speakers. So these places where the two cultures don't quite meet is fascinating for a writer. And I'm always just enchanted now that I'm living in Mexico, because I'm hearing all kinds of phrases and expressions. And it's very exciting as a poet to have more than one language. Because the thing about learning another language is the more you go to another culture or to another language, the more you learn about your native language and your native culture, the more you learn about yourself. Isn't that so?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you know, and I read an interview with you a while back, Sandra, where you talk about, you know, your writing and how maybe I don't know if I'm perhaps misinterpreted your words, but like how your writing, you hear it first in Spanish and on the page.
Yeah,
you write it in English.
I hear it in Spanish, but I write it in English.
Yeah.
Like, you know, oh, what a barbarity! Not if God commanded would I do that, which is really, you know, ay, qué barbaridad.
Qué
Ni Dios
barbaridad.
me lo mande, you know. I'm just translating.
Definitely.
And, you know, and it's funny because then my translator has to like translate it back into Spanish.
Yeah, and I can relate to that. You know, a lot of the dialogue in Tears of the Truffle Pig, I'd say it to myself first in Spanish, and sometimes the phrasing isn't in a way somebody would say it in English because I wrote it as a
I saw that.
Yeah.
Like when he meets tranquilino, they'll say tranquilino esparza at your service.
At your
You don't
service.
say that in English,
Yeah,
so you
you
know
don't.
he's speaking Spanish.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
that I learned from Maxine Hong Kingston in The Woman Warrior, where she had characters speaking Chinese, but she wrote it in English. And she didn't do it by doing any dialect. She just used the word choice.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I grew up a lot watching, like, living on the border, and sometimes you'd pick up stations from the other side, from Mexico, and you'd see American movies with the Spanish subtitles, and so I
Yeah,
grew up.
don't you think though that fusion, like I didn't realize like Nairobi is a big lover of like Mexican culture and Mexican food. I read this in the New York Times. So we're living in a time through the internet, you know, and television and media that we're getting these fusions cultures. You know,
definitely.
It's like I didn't realize before I went to Yugoslavia that before Yugoslavia broke up into states, they only had like 2 channels. And so they would watch all these old Mexican movies.
Oh yes.
Yeah, so when I got there, I was very popular.
Yeah, that's.
You know, I didn't know why people would stop me in the supermarket and quote like old, and, you know, the golden age of Mexican cinema movies dialogue, and I would just look at them like, oh.
That's hilarious. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
funny. I have a friend of mine from Bosnia who, when I met him, she said, "Oh, Veronica Castro." Veronica
But
Castro.
I just got my hair done today at a Bosnian hairdresser that I always go to on Lincoln Avenue, and I startle them when I come in. I go, "Bravo, kako ste? Dobro," and they're always like shocked. How do you know that? I lived in Sarajevo, you know. So those are like the only words I know, but I say them with exuberance. And I think that that's the wonderful thing. The more we travel, the more we find, you know, these parallels, these interesting interstices where the cultures intersect, sometimes by happenstance because that nation only had 2 channels, or sometimes because that nation had a crush on that culture.
Definitely,
No? Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
Hi, Sandra. I've been wanting to ask you this question for many years. I read The House on Mango Street right after it came out. Yes, I'm old. And, and the one thing I noticed, because I hadn't really seen it before, is I kept telling people, this is fiction, but it reads like poetry. So my big question is, were you a poet before you wrote that book, or did you become a poet afterwards?
I was a writer who wrote poetry and fiction starting in middle school. I wrote both. And I was trying to experiment with I loved experimental fiction. So I was trying to experiment and create a story cycle. I didn't know about Gwendolyn Brooks' Maud Martha or other story cycles. And I thought I was creating something new. So I tried to write little stories that were shorts that maybe were a paragraph or a page or 2, and that you could open up at any place. But I wanted them to have that same lyricism and music as poetry. So that was, you know, my poet's ear and my fiction love. But I never studied fiction. And it's a lucky thing because I was free to create as I wished.
yeah.
Thanks for asking.
So for Fernando, I just love the cover art of this Tears of the Truffle Pig. It's just, it's ancient meets future, and I was just curious if there was any story behind it.
Well, to me, writing this, that was very important for me. It needed to be very ancient. I needed to access mythology, even if the mythology didn't exist. And it was also important for me to relate past, present, and future. Past that, it needed to be the present. I needed to have all these issues that at the time were really affecting me. And at the time, and I was also trying to be access something futuristic that I didn't know, which was the unknown in this. So I was very lucky. Na Kim designed the cover, and she did an amazing job. As soon as I saw it, I was like, "That's it. That's what it's got to be," So I'm glad that it comes through. That those two very important aesthetics that are in the book.
Yeah, my name is Sandra, and congratulations on both of your works. I stopped writing, but I thought that when I was writing, I relate to a lot of people, and whenever I speak with people, everything relates to my work, and my work related to the people, and I always find connections. And that's when humans sometimes we aim for. We always see connections. And one of the connections that I don't know if you've noticed, that your last names are very poetic as well. Cisneros, swine, it's Cisnes, and then Flores. That is flourishing.
Yeah, Flores,
thank you,
flowers,
Flores,
and
yeah.
swan
Flowers.
keeper is what my name means.
Yeah.
So
You know
have-
what, though, I think, I don't know about you, but I've done my DNA, and we have Sephardic Jewish ancestry. And a lot of times when people wanted to get a new last name so they wouldn't be identified, they took the names of flowers
Yeah,
or towns, no?
definitely.
Yeah, I think a lot of the Sephardic Jewish people emigrated during the conquest. A lot of those foot soldiers were Jewish and couldn't survive in Spain, so they just said, "Okay, I'm going to go to the New World and find my fortune." And later on, during the colonial period, many of the Jewish people couldn't find themselves comfortable in Mexico City, so they went up north to Monterrey, where and a lot of the people from Monterrey settled in Texas.
Yes.
So we have a lot of Jewish ancestry in the Mexican people in those parts. I don't know if you've done your DNA test.
I have not. One
I
day.
bet you're
I will.
Tarahumara.
I'm
'cause you can't-
scared.
Tall Mexican, gotta be
I'm tall.
Tarahumara,
I'm too tall.
Yeah.
Too tall for DNA tests.
Hello, my question is, doing my work as a student, I'm fascinated by novels that contain hybrid language, so the English with the Spanish inclusions, and I just wonder what your process is. Was it intentional, or is it just the way the language came from you?
Is it for both of us?
Yes, please.
Well, first I'll say that House of Mango Street really doesn't have very much Spanish because at that time my Spanish was spoken to one parent and English to my mom, even though my mother was bilingual, but my father is the immigrant. My mother's Mexican-American, my father was Mexican. So I grew up with the two languages rather separate. But then when I moved in, when I was 30, I moved to Texas. And people in Texas speak in a very different way, right? A very creative way of mixing the language. So I was very fascinated with
Totally.
that. So I was trying to reflect that reality in Woman Hollering Creek. And you can speak to the reality of the Texas way of mixing the languages.
Yeah, to me, I guess I was trying to, capture the vernacular of South Texas. To be honest, I never think about the language. I'm like, oh, this is how people talk down here.
That's how they talk. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So whenever it freaks me out to actually think like, oh yeah, there is Spanish here in this book. I guess I'm not conscious of it when I'm creating it because I'm just trying to reflect.
What you hear.
Yeah,
You're trying
exactly.
to reflect what you hear.
Exactly. And a lot of the times, I've heard you say this before as well. A lot of times I'm unaware as to what I am doing until afterwards, and I go back and I'm like, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing. I did it, but at the time when I'm doing it, I have no. It's like being in the eye of the hurricane. You can't really see, and
Yeah.
you're just working way through it.
Yeah, that's right.
Hello, congratulations, and it's a pleasure to be witness to this. My question is for both of you guys. I am working on a novel myself, and I'm asking for advice, basically, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people are interested as well. What is your routine? How did you get yourself to sit down and like, okay, I'm going to write this novel?
I think it's very important. Well, the one thing about our craft is we have to work alone. But the bad thing is you also have to share what you've worked on alone with other writers. You can't be your own editor, or your work will always suffer, and it won't be the best because you can't see it. It's like I tell people, it's like cutting your own hair. There's only so much you can do, but somebody has to help you with the back. You see? And a lot of people don't want to hear what other people have to say, but that's the only way you're going to get good. You have to steel yourself and find a collective, other people that are going to be your spirit family that will read your work, and they're not going to say, oh, that's so nice. They're going to say, this is good, but this needs improvement. That's what you need if you're serious. If you're doing it for yourself, do whatever you like. But if you're a serious writer, it's just like trying to work out for the Olympics. If you're going to become an Olympic athlete, you can't just study at home. You need a coach. And you need several coaches, and you need other athletes around you to say, okay, when you jumped on that parallel bar, you slipped here, and I saw this, that you can't see it. You need that community. And fortunately, if you're in a big city, you can either go online, go to your library, or create, as I did, my own writing workshop in my living room with other people. And then you graduate. When everybody can't, you can tell when they're not helping you. It's time to graduate and go to a higher level, find a professional writing workshop, and like poco a poco, step by step, little by little. Okay? And do you have something to add?
That's fantastic advice. No, I'm always very jealous of people who had communities of writers,
Yeah, that's why I created Macondo, because, nobody would invite me to the writing communities in South Texas. So I just said, I'll make my own.
That's great. That's great, because the only people who would read my stories were the editors rejecting my stories,
Yeah, editors don't have time to line edit you.
They don't.
And you need to get a group and a professional writer. And the only way, I just met one of my old students from the old days. She wanted me to look at her manuscript. I said, I don't have time anymore. I'm reading books like yours and blurbing them. I always have a dozen books that are waiting for blurbs. I said, I will look at 3 poems only because I know you. But you need to find a mentor, and I'm going to find you a mentor and connect you, because that's what you need.
Yes.
And for myself, I have 3 or 4 people that I share my essays with, my poetry with, and my fiction with. That it's a minimum. And the more people you have doing quality control, the better your writing. Becoming good is not an accident, it's work. And are you willing to do the work? Young writers, I say my advice, 1, earn your own money, because your parents don't want you to be a writer. And as long as you're earning your own money, then you can control your destiny. 2, control your fertility, because it's very hard to become a writer if you are veered off your brilliant career because you have an unwanted pregnancy. Male or female is very important. Control your fertility. No excuses. This is 2019, not 1920. Number 3, solitude is sacred. As women, sometimes we feel sorry for ourselves. We don't have a date. We don't go out with anyone. We don't have a boyfriend. We don't have a girlfriend. That's your time that destiny's giving you to nurture and develop your art. So
That's great. Yeah, it's true.
Hi.
Hi.
The House on Mango Street writes about oppression that Esperanza and other characters are facing on Mango Street, while the book simultaneously would have been facing oppression too, where Chicana literature doesn't have the same opportunities as others does. Was this something you were aware of while you were writing or worried about, or it just kind of never really
No,
crossed your mind?
when I was writing it, I was a teacher, and there's an introduction and a couple of introductions that are in the book, A House of My Own, That's a very autobiographical collection of essays. And I talk about how my students were troubling me. Plus, I was trying to please everybody. I was 22 to 28, which is fatal years for women. You know, your 20s, but it only lasts 10 years, don't worry. And, you know, it's like you try to please your mother, you try to please your father, you try to please your loves, you try to please society, you try to please the church, but you don't please yourself, so you really suffer. And I think that, you know, at that time, I wasn't a political being, but I worked with Marxist and anarchist and everybody that has an ism except me. I was just an artist at the school I was working at in Pilsen. And I wanted to have some political path, but I didn't find that feminism spoke to me as a working class woman at that time. So eventually I would find, you know, the working class feminist, but in the beginning I was just searching for how does one survive and not repeat the tragedy of your mother's life or your grandmother's life. I was looking for otro modo de ser, as Rosario Castellanos, a feminist poet, would say, another way to be without throwing yourself in front of a train or locking yourself in an attic and going mad. There has to be another way to be, she says in that poem. And that's what I was looking for. And I used Esperanza asking that question. It was in my consciousness, but I didn't have an answer. I think every novel is a question walking towards an answer. But you don't know the question until you get the answer. It's a breech baby. Once you get the answer, then the book is done. And it's totally reversed. So I didn't know what my question was until I finished the book, and I said, oh, that's it. No.
We can take one more question over here for the folks who've been.
You know, don't worry. We will answer your questions when we're signing books, and we will give you eye contact, and, you know, so don't worry. Don't you worry.
Hi, thank you both for sharing your wisdom and processes and love with us. I have a question. So a large stereotype and misconception of Latinx children is that they come from homes that are knowledgeless and illiterate. And you both mentioned being from households that maybe didn't have text, physical text, but you both discuss the rich literacies that come from your homes, like oral sharing, dichos, cuentos. And I'm wondering how you incorporate that in your writing process, in your text, that kind of expands those notions of literacy to push back on those deficit narratives about Latinx children, Latinx homes, and the cultural wealth that comes from these communities.
Fernando, I'm going to let you go first.
You know, I think my responsibility in that sense is to take in the history of, you know, Latinx literature and, you know, what we call Chicano literature, Mexican American literature, and go beyond that, go to, you know, South American literature, to just expand my notions of literature and everything, and to take in all those influences and blend them, when they blend together through you and through my work. Anything that I write is going to be called like Latinx or Mexican American. So I think that that's what I'm contributing to it by being as open to other writers and artists that came before me and who continue to work, and to push myself to create material that is new to myself and to my community.
I think one of the things for myself is, like, you know, when I left graduate school, I realized a lot of the writers that I loved, Nicanor Parra and Borges and Juan Rulfo, and later on I would find the women. Of course, you don't find the women, you find the men translated, and you have to dig in the rubble. It was my curiosity to find my history. That was, you know, I was a colonized woman, that I knew all about, you know, Chaucer and Shakespeare, but I didn't know anything about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. I didn't know anything about pre-conquest poetry. You know, I didn't know my history, and I still don't know it, and I'm still searching. I'm still trying to shine a spotlight on the women who are my heroes, like Teresita Urrea, the shaman healer from North Mexico. and Arizona. And Maria Sabina, the great Maria Sabina shamaness from Oaxaca, healer. We should know who Maria Sabina is, but
Yes.
people don't know who she is. And there's just like Nahui Olin, the muse and the artist, and Rosa Covarrubias, who was the wife of Miguel Covarrubias, but famous in her own right for being Chicana. She was Mexican-American Scottish from California, belonged to the Ted Shawn dancers in the 1920s. These are revolutionary women. These are revolutionary women, and we don't know them. We don't teach them to our daughters. Or, I'm tired of looking at these books on goddesses and famous women, and there's no one from the Americas. Everybody's from Egypt or Europe, or, where's, I love that poem by Luis Alfaro. He has this poem where the chorus says, "Where are my heroes?" And he hits himself. "Where are my heroes? Where are my saints?" It's a litany of tragedy happening in his life in the gay community. And I feel like that. Where are my heroes? Where are my saints? I'm going to find them, and I'm going to shine a light on them so that you will read them. That's why Maria Sabina makes a cameo in Caramelo. But I want to shine lights on all of these characters so that Frida Kahlo was just one of the tip of the iceberg of these women that were more modern than women in 2019. And if we want our women to be strong and powerful, we have to dig our own history, because if you don't do it, it's not going to be done by the Board of Education. So, you have to. Everybody here has to tell their own stories. We have to research our own history, because we're not going to get it from the public schools or even the private schools. People are limited of, what they were given. And if we don't find our heroes, we have to search for them ourselves.
That's true. Yeah. In a way, you have to learn to build your own canon, and
Exactly.
too, by
and
searching.
Who are your favorite writers? I forgot to ask you that.
There's so many.
Name 5 favorites.
Name 5 big writers. I always lean towards the underground writers that nobody knows.
Right?
I guess. Like who? Let me see. Who? I like this late 19th century French Jewish writer named Marcel Schwob, that wrote this weird book called Imaginary Lives. And there's short stories about these famous people, like, I think he has one about Pocahontas in there, but little short stories about mundane events in these famous people's lives that he wrote. And that affected me a lot, goes without saying. Sandra, of course, your work, of course. Rosario Castellanos, who nobody talks about ever, who's a Mexican
Great
Mexican feminist writer.
poet.
Yes, definitely.
Novelist
too. Yeah, she died quite tragically. I forget. I think she was electrocuted or something.
She was electrocuted putting in a light bulb in Egypt, where she was an ambassador
right.
to Egypt.
Yeah,
something real
definitely.
weird.
Yeah, another writer, Clarissa Lispector. Who is a goddess? Yeah,
Brazilian writer.
Yeah, she wrote a book called Agua Viva that to me is like a prayer. The book's like 80 pages long, but there's no characters and there's no plot in the book. And you're reading it and you're like, oh my God, what is this woman doing? This woman is going through this spiritual journey and awakening and going through history and herself. And it's this meditation, and I never read anything like it before. I read that book like 10 times.
Wow.
And every time I'm like, oh my God, what is happening,
Do you read big fat biographies, like that big fat one of Clarice Lispector, that you could kill somebody if you dropped it on
No,
their
I
head?
haven't yet. No, I can't bring myself to read about her somehow.
See, I like to read about several biographies of Van Gogh or Hans Christian Andersen, 7 of them, and then reread their work.
That's great. Yeah.
Because why? I'm trying to survive. How do we survive as writers? Most of us don't get paid for our writing. I'm very lucky, but I'm less than 1% of Latino writers that earns from her pen. And, how do we survive as writers? They never tell you that in the bio note. They said, oh, she lives in San Antonio and, is the mother of so. But I want to know, how does she make her money? When I was a younger writer, I was just trying to figure it out. Totally. And I think people, the public hears our awards, but I think we should write a bio of our failures.
Yeah, definitely,
and
yeah.
we survive those. To be here, to have our name on a book is extraordinary.
Yeah, it truly is. I can count my successes in life with one hand, probably, and have fingers left over, But this book, any book is built on so many failures, I think. Every time you see a
Yes.
book, you just know that there's so many failures behind that book to make it happen.
Exactly.
And you just have to, you can't let the failures keep you down. You can do it for like a day. Do it, feel terrible for a day, do whatever you can. Next day, wake up hungover or whatever and deal with it, and it's fine,
I think it's time for us to end. I want to
Yeah.
thank the museum for having us here and putting us together.
Thank
It's
you
just
so
such a
much.
treat.
Thanks to all of you for coming out
All
as
for
well.
coming out.